So, before we get into the thick of things, how would you describe survival mode?
Daily life. You, and I say that I know that's a general statement. I was diagnosed neurodivergent in 1989 when I was 5 years old and also had language processing disorder, you, anxiety, depression, eating disorders, body dysmorphia, and then later on, sexual assault and domestic violence. So when I think about survival mode, I think about how every day you're just hoping and praying that you make it the next couple hours, the next half day, the next day to see the sunshine the next morning. And you're not only hoping for the sunshine, you're hoping for things to change, even though you've gone down this path of realizing it may or it may not. And you don't know when that's going to turn, if it's going to turn. And there's variations of it. There's variations of how those things play into and there's the self-acceptance of your circumstance and how that benefits you in the long run. But then as more things get added to it. So going back to my central point, survival mode to me is every day.
hmm And I can relate to that definition. I think healing happens in phases and over time. And a lot of times we begin our healing process thinking, okay, we will just exit survival mode here. It doesn't necessarily happen that way. So being able to navigate our day to day is really survival mode for many of us because I'm so burdened by what I'm dealing with, what I've gone through, that I just need to make it to the next point in time where I don't feel so weighed down by that burden that I feel. So definitely can relate to that. Welcome to Survival Mode Disrupted, the podcast for those who are done performing, done people pleasing, and done living life on autopilot. I'm your host, Letitia, the Survival Mode Disruptor, and this is where we create disruptive, unapologetic transformations for those who are ready to exit survival mode and reclaim their power. Every episode is your permission slip to burn the rule book, break the cycle, and finally build a life that feels like yours. So let's disrupt everything that's holding you back and start living life on your own terms. This is your trigger warning. This podcast is raw. It is real and it doesn't sugarcoat what it means to survive trauma, abuse, mental health battles, or even the aftermath of living in survival mode for too damn long. What you hear on Survival Mode Disrupted includes unfiltered stories, graphic details, and a vulnerable truth that may trigger some of the audience. Please prioritize your emotional safety. If something feels too heavy, pause, breathe, come back when you're ready or not at all. Your healing is yours to honor. These episodes are based on lived experience, not therapy sessions or clinical advice. Listening does not replace mental health treatment or constitute a coach client relationship. If you're in crisis, please seek immediate help from a licensed professional or contact your local emergency services. This space is built with care, but it's also built for truth and built for disruption. Take what you need, leave the rest, and most of all, trust yourself. If this podcast speaks to your soul, you don't have to do this work alone. Feel free to join our free Facebook community for high achieving women ready to break cycles and heal out loud. Join us at Disrupting Survival Mode on Facebook, or grab the book that started this movement, Exiting Survival Mode, raw step by step guide to help you identify, release, and rebuild from the survival patterns that have been keeping you stuck. Hello, 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 and welcome to season three of Survival Mode Disrupted. I am your host, Letitia. I am a trauma recovery mentor, I'm podcaster, author. I am also a survivor of teen dating violence. And I'm kicking off season three with conversations around what teen dating violence looks like and what it means to heal beyond that, because I think it's important. We don't talk enough about abuse, period. But we definitely don't talk about the intricacies that happens when someone is being abused as a child or teenager. And I really just want to be able to use this platform to bring awareness to the fact that 1 in 3 teens globally are impacted by dating violence. And a lot of times adults don't even know that it's happening. So I am excited to bring you these conversations to kick off season three, because I really just want to bring awareness to what is really happening out there so that parents, number one, can have awareness. And teens, if you are catching these episodes or if someone is sharing it with you, you don't have to suffer in silence like I did. And probably like my guest did as well. So, welcome, and I'm really excited. So, today we have Dan. Dan, why don't you introduce yourself?
Hi, everybody. Thank you for having me on to Survival Mode. This is such a powerful, important topic that I really don't see enough people that look like me having these conversations with. My name is Dan. I am a TEDx speaker, author. I'm a neurodivergent father to twin autistic daughters. I have been working in advocacy for the better part of 25 years, even before I realized what I had personally gone through. And now I sit here with you as a domestic violence and sexual assault survivor. Not necessarily, and I want to preface this by saying that for those that are neurodivergent, we typically mature from a social standpoint later on. So I ask you to extend that teenage years to, the early 20s, because there's still a lot of catching up to do within the neurodivergent community, especially with males.
And I think this is going to be a very interesting conversation because, first of all, like you said, there isn't a lot of conversations around teen dating violence, particularly from a male point of view. So that is why I've chosen your story to kick off season three. Dan, I would really love to hear your story to end through survival mode.
So it's extremely difficult for me. I think when you're a survivor, and especially one that is very self-aware, and I think one of my superpowers is being self-aware, it's very difficult to separate things that happen with the resulting effect. So what I mean by that is I'm going to give you my story of domestic violence and sexual assault, but I think to give a little bit of context, everybody should know that I started feeling depressed when I was 6, 7, 8 years old. I started developing an eating disorder right around that same age, and then body dysmorphia soon thereafter, although I had no idea what body dysmorphia was. And because of the anxiety, depression, coupled with the way that I was looking at myself and not feeling like I was worthy and not feeling like I had a place in the world, my belief is that it made me more susceptible to falling into circumstances that shouldn't have been. So that's my lead in to what actually happened. So all through high school, I barely dated. I was focused strictly on getting through. I think I passed with a D plus average. Got into college. I had never been away from home and scared out of my mind. And then the end of my freshman year, the summer of going into my sophomore year, I met this girl, and she I don't remember feeling like an initial attraction, but I remember instinctually that she was interested in me. And when somebody shows interest in you, when you have that low self-esteem, it's like, yeah, it's like getting a mushroom in Mario Kart. You just start, you're like off to the races. So even though there wasn't a whole lot of attraction, it was a situation where it became, I went with it and became a relationship. We spent a lot of time doing things together. I was over her house all the time, and we were, you know, she adopted a ferret or something like that while I was there. Like things that like when you're that young, you're like, oh, that's a big deal. This is a big deal. Anyway, at the time, I was a virgin, and it was my first time really having somebody that was interested in me. So over that summer, I was just an excited, I'm just going to bluntly say it, I was a horny 19-year-old kid. We would fool around, and there was points that she would do things that made me extremely uncomfortable. And I remember sitting there thinking, I don't like this. I'm telling her to stop. She's not stopping. But I thought it was just part of a normal relationship. So I didn't think anything of it. I didn't do anything about it. Fast forward, this is continuing on, but fast forward, we go back to school. And she went to school about 45 to an hour away. As a 19-year-old kid, I'm working in retail, making, and I'll put it in UK terms, maybe £5 an hour, uh, just to basically have enough money to drive there every weekend and see her and maybe take her out to dinner. Well, this wasn't enough for her, and the longer time went on, the more that she got frustrated, the more that she would really start to lay into me from both a mental perspective and talking about how bad I was, how I was such a waste of time. But also, she would dig her nails into my arms to the point that I was bleeding. And she would just start laughing. And then there were other moments where we'd be laying in bed together, and all of a sudden, she would just knee me in the groin as hard as she could. And I'm gasping in pain. And she's just sitting there laughing. Or right after we were intimate, she would do the same thing just to get a reaction out of me. And it definitely didn't feel good, but I was so desperate. I remember thinking distinctly, this is the best I'm ever going to get, so I just need to suck it up. That I just went along with it. And then we got to a point where she was part of a sorority, and we had her dance or something like that. So I spent months saving up for to pay for this, and we wound up going. And on the way home, when I was driving back to school, I remember getting a text, "Oh, by the way, we're done." And swerved the car, stopped on the side of the road, broke down in tears, wondering what had happened, what had gone wrong. And her response was, "You never have any money, you never do anything, we never have anything fun." Just went on and on and on. And looking back, I grieved this relationship because I didn't think that I could do any better. Now, I still have the scars on my arm from when I was 19. I'm 41 years old now. And, oh, excuse me, I grieved and grieved and grieved. Now, later on, interestingly, fast forward to the time I'm 35, 36, she finds me on Facebook and messages me. And she starts acting like nothing had happened. I said, well, wait a second. Don't you have any remorse for the way that things had happened all those years ago? And she's like, what are you talking about? And she completely gaslit me. Thankfully, even though at the time I had not fully understood what had happened, at the time I had enough self respect for myself and was with my spouse. I'm like, you know what, I'm just going to block you and see you later. So I knew a little bit about what my situation had been. I knew that certain things were not right, but it wasn't until I was 39 that I was listening to a friend talk about her experience with domestic violence that it occurred to me what had actually happened and what I had been through. So it took nearly 20 years for me to understand the full context of what had happened and that it was domestic violence and that it was sexual assault. And it, so I'm still in that. I look back at how that relationship shaped who I am and who I became and how things transpired from that point forward. And I'm still connecting the dots, but what a massive shift. So that's a bit of the story. And hopefully, I hope nobody relates to it, but if you are a guy out there, it happens.
It absolutely does happen. And I want to explore what you said last. Get into this place of realization that what you went through was actually abuse. A lot of us who've experienced abuse, particularly from young, it takes us years to reconcile what actually happened to us. And this is something slightly different. However, I'm going to say it anyway. I lost my virginity at 12 due to rape. I did not recognize it was rape until I was in my 30s because as a child, I thought I wanted what happened, right? Like when I processed it retrospectively, I thought I wanted it. But there was this reconciliation that I expressed that I didn't want it multiple times. But because I had that desire, I kind of wrote off what happened as assault, similar to what you were talking about. Although I knew that the person that I was with at 14, an older man, more than twice my age, it was an inappropriate relationship, and I knew that I shouldn't have been hit by this man, which I had been over a course of years. I didn't recognize everything else that was happening in the relationship was abuse as well. And a lot of the time I spent justifying his behavior as a result of my own. Right? So I think it's an important point to raise, particularly around this subject, because I think a lot of people are quite harsh on themselves once they get to that point of recognizing what they've been through. And there's no reason for that, right? A lot of times we're operating from a space where back then we had a lot less information, but we tend to judge ourselves on the information that we have once we come to that realization. And that is actually a dangerous point to be in because it transfers the responsibility to the person from the person who is actually causing the harm to us because of how we carry the narrative, how we process what was going on. Now I
Well,
want to go ahead.
so I don't mean to interrupt, but I would be remiss if I didn't bring up this following point. I think one of the big hiccups that both men and women get into is the idea that it consenting to one thing doesn't mean consenting to everything.
Mhm.
And that's something like I know for a fact a lot of people struggle with because they feel like if I want to be sexual with this person, then I don't have a say in what goes on. But like in my situation, I was consenting to certain things, but I didn't like the one thing being done. I asked to stop repeatedly. That does cross a line. And that's where when we're young, we don't have the thought process to set those structures and those boundaries because we don't necessarily even know. So I'll say it again for those listening. Consent to some is not consent to all.
And that's a strong point to make. But it also goes back to the point that I wanted to make about you mentioning that feeling of unworthiness, right? A lot of times, the reason why the structures and boundaries are difficult for us to process quite early on is because we are anchored in that unworthiness, right? Whenever I tell my story, and right now I'm doing a 28-day campaign around teen dating violence. My very first story, however, as I outline what I went through, was before the abuse. There was a girl who felt unworthy. There was a girl who wanted to be seen and accepted and understood. And a lot of people don't recognize that that's often what gives birth to abuse. People are able to see our desperation, right? We can't help but show up like that. If we have, especially you said yours started 6, 7 around that time, right? So now 13 years later, you've had multiple experiences that have given you evidence that support the unworthiness that you were feeling, right? So then you get into these relationships and you don't recognize that that's where you're leading from. So you're quite desperate for the acceptance. You're quite desperate to be seen. And then you latch on to whoever gives you that, right? And in latching on, we often self abandon because that need, that desire, that core desire of feeling seen and understood and accepted, it supersedes everything else.
Yeah.
But oftentimes, that unworthiness comes before, and then it exponentially grows in the environments where people take advantage of the desperation of a human need. Another thing that you mentioned that I don't think that we talk about enough with abuse, and this is not just teen abuse, it's abuse period, is the grief of the relationship, which a lot of people don't understand. We have left, we either leave or we're discarded, but then we're the ones left trying to pick up the pieces and try to make sense of everything. I remember walking away from my first abusive relationship because I ended up in multiple. I felt like such a failure because I had married the guy, right? So like the weight of the failure of my marriage was heavy to carry. I didn't know how to process that. And I wasn't, I had just turned 21. So having to process all of that, the grief, coming to the reconciliation that beyond this relationship, I don't even know who I am. And I am just stepping into adulthood, trying to figure that part out, right? Like now now I have to adult, but I'm carrying heavy weight that could cripple adults. That does cripple adults, and then still trying to navigate the changes that naturally occur. Let's talk a little bit about how you were able to move beyond that grief. Was it entering into a new relationship or was it working on you?
It wasn't at the point. So I wasn't at the point where I was self-aware or confident enough because in order to break the cycle, you need something to come in that shifts your narrative, that shifts your focus and your thought process. I jumped into another relationship and what a story that one is. I so I would routinely try to hop from relationship to relationship. And here was the thing with me. At the time, I was in great physical shape, at least materially. So through all my years in going through depression, going through anxiety, the one thing I always had control of was my physicality. It played into my body dysmorphia. I would be in the gym and so I always leaned on how I looked to try to get inroads to relationships, which were typically very face value. And that created additional issues as we went through that. And just to give everybody a brief story, because I think it's important to mention, the next relationship I wound up in after that was a girl I met on a Jewish dating site. And I remember she lived in New York. I was in New Jersey at the time. And I went up there for the first time. She offered me to take a hit. And at the time, I'm like, okay, well, no harm, no foul. Well, I did. And then the second time, I went into anaphylactic shock. So here I am in a city I've never been to with a girl that I was on a first date with in anaphylactic shock. The ambulance is called. I get driven to another borough in New York where I am sitting there with a girl that I don't know in a city I don't know. And whatever we did wound up being laced with something. It's, but here's the critical part for the story. Afterwards, I remember thinking, oh, she stayed with me at the hospital, so she must be a good person. And that led to a multi-month relationship where, again, she broke up with me, even though the writing was on the wall from the very, very beginning. And I bring this up to show people that it's a pattern, it's a cyclical pattern of self-destruction that it puts us in. And you could we could make the argument that somebody should have stepped in and said something, but whether they did or not, when you're in that environment, you don't want to listen to anybody else. So even had somebody said something to me at the time, is there a guarantee that I would have listened? No. And unfortunately, I feel like more often than not, we have to hit rock bottom before we can pull ourselves out. The sad truth of the matter is that only some of us will survive rock bottom.
That's an important point. That's a very important point. And that feeling of unworthiness that leads to desperation of basic human needs often has us in a space where we are ignoring the red flags, right? Like we justify them. Like the reason why you were in the hospital in a different city and around nobody that you knew was because of this glaring red flag that happened to create a medical emergency for you, right? But even in that, there was this justification. Well, she came to the hospital, so she possibly cares, right? And then you be anchored into that. I remember leaving my abusive husband and thinking everything's just going to magically snap back into place. But I was still very desperate. I was desperate for someone to just love me for me. So I get into another relationship, and the red flags, let me tell you, they were slapping me in my face. Okay. But what I justified was he's not hitting me. So it's better than what I was dealing with. I didn't have
Exactly.
the understanding. I didn't have the awareness, like you talked about, that I was still being abused, right? But I was being abused in a different way. Instead of physical abuse, now there was financial abuse, which wasn't there before. So while I did recognize that there was a problem, here is this person who has enough patience to deal with the broken me. So I can deal with what I was going on, even though I'm being accosted by these red flags.
You're thinking you're taking a step in the right direction, and in reality, it's just a bird of a different feather.
Yes.
And by the way, I want to mention, as everybody is listening to this, I want to show gratitude to you for sharing your story. I don't think people realize enough that, like, you and I are having this conversation very fluidly about this. And some people may think, oh, it's easy for them to talk about. No, None of this is ever easy to talk about. We talk about it for a reason, we talk about it for a purpose, and so that other people don't have to, or in my case, I'm trying to create a better world for my and a better example for my kids so that they don't hit that same point. Doesn't make it easy.
And you're absolutely right. It took me nearly 20 years to talk about what I went through as a child. And I was kind of pushed. I started my business. I started off as a life coach, and this was 6 years ago, nearly seven. And I got stuck in my business because I felt like I was an imposter. I was a hypocrite, right? Because there were still things that I hadn't addressed. I just moved on. It wasn't until I got trauma-informed training that I actually recognized just how much of who I was operating from trauma responses. Like I was a people pleaser. I would have never said that. I would have never called myself a people pleaser. I thought I was like the kindest person going, right? I was an overperformer. I learned to perform. I also learned how to self-abandon by refusing to advocate for myself. And all of those things showed up for years and years until that rock bottom. And for me, it was a jail cell.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And I was forced to deal with the things that I had very neatly compartmentalized and just moved on. And I thought life was amazing. You know what I mean? Like my career was excelling. I was doing great in other aspects of my life. But because those core trauma issues were never addressed, they followed me through most of my adulthood. And it wasn't until somebody helped me pull the layers back and, first of all, recognize that I had been operating from a space of victimhood for a very long time, which then probably didn't probably, it kept me in that cycle that I couldn't see. But often that's what happens. We end up on this hamster wheel of compartmentalization and performance just to make it through the day. And then that day becomes weeks, months, years, decades. And we haven't really moved forward because we're anchored into what happened to us as a child. And often because we don't know to question it, even though we know at the core is wrong.
And I think part of that, this is the core of what I get into on a regular basis. But I think the core of that is just, and I can't, this is a global audience, so I want to be careful how I approach this. But in the United States, at least, it's the white oppressive system and the generational and gender hierarchy and normative behaviors that put us in this position where we don't know what we're doing, especially within different cultural populations. I mean, in the United States, less than 10 to 15% of psychologists and psychiatrists are black. So how can somebody that's African American go in and have somebody that relates? Similar with Hispanic populations in, Jewish populations like my own. So my theory on it and the way that I try to approach it is, as parents, how can we alter how we are teaching our kids, how we are bringing up our kids to create more awareness so that they have the facilities that when these things happen, they can both feel comfortable talking to us and know we're not going to be coming at it from a place of judgment, but also have the resources already in place and the understanding that they know that it's wrong. And some would call it abolition, and they wouldn't be wrong because I do believe that abolitionism is a certain necessary part of at least American society. But it's just, how do we go through and go through our own decolonization process? How do we identify what part of generational trauma is affecting us so that we can then face it head on?
Mm. And that's an important point, right? Representation is very important, particularly in the healing space. But another thing that we also have to consider in this conversation is conditioning, cultural conditioning as
Yep.
well, right? Like I grew up around phenomenally strong Black women. Like I grew up around people who were rewriting histories in ways, right? Like my mom and her sisters are Guinness Book record holders,
Wow.
right? So what I grew up learning was I could never be weak as a Black woman. I could never express weakness as a Black woman. What that did in those situations, that conditioning was keep me silent, right? Not because I didn't want help, because I did, but I didn't want to admit that I was weak because the way that I was raised did not support a weak Black woman. And then on top of that, like you mentioned, I'm trying to think. No, I'm gonna go back.
No, it's okay. But what you're talking about is the invincibility complex that we grow up to believe that our parents are invincible. And my father was my hero, right?
Hmm.
And he could do nothing wrong. And I didn't have a lot of male role models growing up. So he could do no wrong. But what that did is that created something where I felt like I had to live up to what he was doing. It wasn't until I was 19 or 20 that I had a conversation with my aunt. I found out some things. I'm like that, like my world became shattered by this thought. Okay, my dad isn't perfect. Bringing this back to how we raise our kids and what you were just referring to, I purposely talk to my kids. Like if they see me sad because I can't hide my feelings most often, I will tell them daddy's sad. If I am frustrated, I will say daddy's frustrated. Daddy needs a minute. Daddy's overstimulated, whatever the case may be. And the purpose in that is by telling them that that's breaking through that barrier, excuse me, of invincibility and showcasing that they can have those feelings because, well, if daddy has them, then it's okay for me too. If you're
Hmm.
talking about a situation with your family where the stoicism and the lead by example, silent but heavy, is what's pushed to the front, then in one part that's great, but there needs to be a parallel on the other side that has that emotional grounding.
Hmm. I agree with you 100% there. And I just want to go back to something that you said earlier. And I love what you said about what being open and honest with your kids. Um, I'll touch on that in a minute. But I believe that the key to ending teenage dating violence, it begins with the relationship with the parents, right? Being a safe emotional space for your children is so important. And I say this because it played a huge role in my story, right? Like when I started going with the man that abused me, I grew up in a small community. Bermuda, 21 square miles. Your business travels faster than the flu. So it wasn't hidden. My mom approached me about my relationship. She had done a background check of this man. She learned that almost all of his relationships ended with a restraining order. And she came and warned me. But for years before that, her and I had a very contentious relationship. I felt unseen. I felt like I was a bother to her. So when she came and expressed concerns about what was going on, that essentially could have saved me 8 years of torment because of that relationship was so strained. I couldn't hear her. I didn't believe her. So creating that safe space for your children is an a necessity. Yes, our role as parents is to steer our children in the right direction, which includes discipline. It includes being stern and following rules. However, there has to be a concession in some way for a safe space for our children without the discipline, without the judgment as you spoke about. And I'm gonna go back to what you said about how honest you are with your daughters. I told you before we started recording, I homeschool my kids. And I mean, it's multiple reasons why I do. Probably because I'm a helicopter parent, and I don't apologize for that, right?
Yeah.
Helicopter tiger, whatever you want to call it. I am there. But before I started with ABCs and one, two, threes, we started with emotions and giving them the tools to be able to express them healthy. And that is so important, right? I think, and I've talked about this so much on this podcast because it comes up in almost every conversation. We are conditioned from a very young age to self-abandon, to keep everybody else around us comfortable. And part of that is often ignoring our emotions. So when we get to a place where we're overburdened by the emotions that we're feeling and we don't have the tools to be able to express that, that creates a bigger dynamic, a dangerous dynamic, particularly if we're talking about children who are dealing with big emotions because they are being abused and being diminished in ways that we often don't talk about. Not even having the tools to express your emotions. Detrimental.
Yeah. And you and I both share the fact that we have neurodivergent children, and one of my daughters is not fully verbal. So having to learn how within neurodivergence and within autism, you have to, it's not about you learning from them in many instances. It's about, sorry, it is about you learning from them, not them learning from you. You have
Mhm,
to pick up on those idiosyncrasies that they're showcasing that may not be head on, that are their way of expressing emotions. And you have to remove your what you think should happen, and you have to figure out a way to conform it to what they need and what works for them.
mhm,
And this is where, and I could get into a rant about this, but this is where, especially for multi-spousal families, so both parents being together or both parents in the picture, there needs to be more effective balance on both sides. It can't be, okay, well, daddy's going to do it one way and mommy's going to do it the other, or mommy's going to do it this way and the other mommy's going to do it that way. It has to be uniform, and it has to be based off of what you're being given.
mhm,
And this is another concept that I don't think people look at tightly enough. Oftentimes, our response to trying to solve somebody else's problem is to go off of what would work for us. They
mhm,
are not us. So ask from a place of learning, from a place of curiosity, and take, it's not ego, but take that component and put it to the side so that you could really get to the base root of what is going on. And philosophically, that's really at the crux of everything.
mhm. I think we are hardwired to experience life from our own perspective, right? Like that's just how it is. However, when it comes to parenting, it's not that cut and dry. And like you said, it's being willing Because a lot of us aren't really like you and I grew up in the 80s, right? Like there's
Yeah.
a whole different kettle of fish than what is happening now. And one of the things that I'm really happy about is the level of consciousness that we have arrived at today, right? Well, a lot better than back in the 80s and 90s.
Okay. Internationally, maybe. In the US, you know who our president is.
I do.
So we'll leave it there. I, I don't need to get divisive, but I could make the case that it's actually worse off. I We're so focused on, and I do think it's a nurture aspect that conceives, but this is where I go back to like the generational trauma and things that we've learned generation over generation after generation carry over, but that doesn't mean that they're accurate. In America, gender norms, gender roles have been around since the foundation of America, but those gender norms are shit. Pardon my French. They don't mean anything. They're not accurate by any depiction. Not if we're trying to truly be in partnership with our spouse and with our partners and with ourselves as individuals. So we really do have to break these barriers from the nurture aspect in order to get into this place where we can then be free. And this is why, going back to something I said in the very beginning, this is why I'm one of the few people talking about this, because at the end of the day, what we have to do in order to progress is realize that giving of ourselves, changing our behaviors is not a loss of masculinity. It's not a loss of power. It's not a loss of anything. It's simply being more human.
Mm.
And that is really what needs to happen if we're going to have any hope of seeing real change. And I got to applaud international. I got to applaud those in the UK and in Europe and some other places, because the US is very I centric. How can I make a better world? How can I do better things? Whereas what I found internationally and in Europe, it's more depicted on how can we, and that is such we have an example of where we need to be. We're just too white led, too ignorant to get there.
And you're also being led by someone who has frontal lobe dementia, which it just doesn't even make sense, but we're not even going to go there. Listen, Dan, I've really enjoyed this conversation
Me
because
too.
it wasn't straight line. We have touched on some very important topics here. And I just, just want to reiterate to the audience the reason why we're having these conversations. First of all, is about awareness. A lot of times we really just don't understand. And we've talked about domestic violence at length on this podcast, right? But not from a perspective of how we navigated from childhood, and how it shapes us as adults. And you mentioned getting to the place of rock bottom, which unfortunately some don't survive. But Dan, I really have enjoyed this conversation. So tell us a bit more about how we can connect with you online.
Sure. So, first of all, thank you for allowing me to do that. To those that are in Nigeria, my second home, Shawadada, good to see you. Sorry, I'm hearing my daughter scream. I've been having a meltdown. So, to reach me, there's a couple of ways. You could reach me on LinkedIn, you could reach me on Facebook. I am a professional speaker, so book Dan to speak at gmail.com. It was about as straightforward as can be. I'm represented by a speaker bureau. I'm on there. Or you could reach out to you and you could put me in contact, whatever you need. I'm open and honest. What you see is what you get. And my TEDx is really derivative of what we're talking about. So it's all about how we need to change how we parent in order to create a better world. And I use my experience with eating disorder and body dysmorphia as a way to really showcase that. So if you're interested in hearing more about that story, that will be out in March. So yeah, and for those that are listening, please make sure you give Survival Mode a follow, tell 5 friends about it. let them know that this is a podcast that's making difference and changing lives and will continue to do so.
Thank you, Dan. I appreciate that. And we'll definitely make sure all of that information is in the show notes. But before we wrap it all up, one key takeaway for the audience to action.
Progress doesn't mean losing, it means gaining. And I'll leave with this last piece that I said before because I really don't think it's acknowledged enough. And that simply is giving permission for one thing doesn't mean giving permission for everything.
Yes, that's such a key takeaway, you know. And even if you do give permission, you can always withdraw it.
You really can. And men, don't be afraid to speak out of something if you're in a situation where you're doing something and it gets to a point where you're just uncomfortable, say stop. And if they don't, leave and tell
Yeah.
somebody.
Tell somebody. Yes, definitely. Well, Dan, thank you so much for your time on Survival Mode Disrupted audience. Thank you for catching another episode. Now, usually I give a quick goodbye, but I just want to say this. Parents, if you're watching this and you want to further this conversation, I am hosting a workshop on March 1st called Safe Love for Parents. It's a conversation on how you can create a safe space for your teen to open up about what could be going on in their relationships and giving them the opportunity to exit with support. If this is something that you're interested in, the information is in the show notes. And I just want to remind you, as always, you were not built to break, but you damn sure were not built to just survive. Disrupt the cycle, reclaim your life, and thrive on your own terms. And I will see you next week. Once again, thank you for joining another episode of Survival Mode Disrupted, hosted by the Survival Mode Disruptor, Letitia. You didn't land here by accident. This conversation, it probably cracked something open on purpose. Because survival mode isn't just a phase, it's a pattern, an identity, a prison masked as strength. But here's the truth. You're not broken, you're just unfinished. So if something stirred in you today, don't ignore it, don't numb it, move with it. And I want to once again invite you to join Disrupting Survival Mode, the Facebook community where healing is loud and messy and real. I also want to invite you to buy my book, The Survival Mode Exit Plan, because your breakthrough deserves a blueprint. And if you felt seen today, be sure to share this episode with someone who needs to hear it. Like, subscribe, and drop a review. That's how amplify the voices that need to be heard. And remember, this isn't about fixing yourself. This is about finding yourself again beneath the rubble. Until next time, choose ease, choose power, choose you. This is Survival Mode Disrupted. Let's keep shaking shit up.